Claire had always dreamed of Morocco, her Pinterest boards overflowing with snapshots of tangerine-colored sunsets over the dunes, ancient Medinas woven with spice markets, and labyrinthine alleyways whispering stories of centuries past. After years of pushing her dream to the side, she finally booked a solo trip, a 2-week journey through Marrakesh, Fez, and the Sahara Desert. It was a break from the monotony of her job, a reset from a toxic relationship, and, more than anything, a chance to rediscover her sense of independence. The moment she stepped off the plane at Marrakesh Menara Airport, the dry heat kissed her skin and the scent of saffron and orange blossom danced in the air. It was intoxicating, surreal, and everything she imagined. Her Airbnb host, a middle-aged woman named Salma, greeted her with warm tea and smiles. The home was modest but beautiful, tucked into a quieter corner of the city, its rooftop offering a panorama of the dusty horizon. Salma insisted on helping Claire plan her itinerary, suggesting not just tourist attractions but authentic experiences off the beaten path. On her first day, Claire explored the Medina, dodging motorbikes and weaving through stalls of vibrant textiles, brass lanterns, and sizzling street food. But by the second day, subtle unease crept in. A man selling leather goods had stared at her too long, his gaze lingering as she passed. A boy no older than 10 had tried to grab her wrist near a spice vendor before darting off. When she returned to her Airbnb, she noticed the lock on her door had been replaced. Salma smiled and said it was broken and needed fixing, but Claire couldn't shake the cold slither of doubt down her spine. That night, she barely slept, her dreams warped by distant calls to prayer and flashes of desert landscapes. The next morning, Salma arranged a private tour to the desert with a company she claimed only locals knew about. Claire hesitated, asking if she could just book a standard Merzouga tour online, but Salma insisted that this one would be safer and more special. The driver, a tall, lean man with mirrored sunglasses and a red scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, arrived in a dusty white van. He introduced himself simply as Youssef and hardly spoke as they left Marrakesh behind. At first, Claire enjoyed the solitude, watching the terrain shift from bustling city to open plains, from olive groves to the vast rocky stretches of the pre-Sahara. But hours passed with little conversation, and when she asked questions, he offered clipped, vague answers. At a rest stop, he handed her a bottle of water already opened. Her instincts flared, and she faked a sip, watching him out of the corner of her eye. When they resumed the journey, she noticed there was no cell signal, and the dirt roads they followed didn't match the route she'd seen on Google Maps the night before. The sun had begun its descent by the time they stopped at what he called a desert base, a low-slung, windowless structure tucked behind a rocky hill with no other vehicles in sight. Claire's heart pounded as she stepped out of the van. There were no camels, no tents, no other tourists. Youssef gestured for her to follow, his tone sharp now, not the relaxed silence of earlier. Inside the building, the air grew stale. It smelled of sand, sweat, and something metallic. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish. Her last clear memory was the man behind her placing a hand firmly on her shoulder, and then darkness. She came to in flashes, blurred shapes, a sense of motion, and finally cold stone beneath her back. Her wrists burned. When her eyes adjusted, she realized she was shackled to a wall, deep inside a dimly lit room with no windows. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't scream. Her throat was dry, lips cracked, tongue heavy. In the corner, a single flickering bulb cast shadows that moved as if they were alive. She tried to make sense of what had happened, retracing every decision since her arrival. How had a dream so vivid, so colorful, descended into this waking nightmare? She thought of her phone, her passport, her backpack. Where were they? Did anyone even know she was missing yet? Her last post had been a picture of the Marrakesh Medina with the caption, "Next stop, Sahara Magic." Her family thought she was on a magical desert journey, posting selfies with camels and drinking mint tea under the stars. But the stars weren't visible from where she was. Only darkness, broken by that dim bulb and the constant, terrifying silence. Then she heard it, a shuffle from beyond the locked door, followed by murmuring in a language she didn't understand. Footsteps approached. The doorknob turned, and Claire's heart seized in her chest. What was waiting on the other side would not be a rescue. Claire awoke to the distant clang of metal, her body stiff and sore from the awkward position she had been forced into overnight. Her wrists were bruised from the cold iron cuffs bolted into the stone wall, and her throat ached with thirst. The room was crude and damp, the ceiling low, and the only source of light a weak, flickering bulb dangling by an exposed wire. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize the terror. Maybe it was a mistake, a robbery gone wrong, a hostage situation, but deep down, she knew it was something else entirely. The man who entered the room wasn't Youssef, but another figure draped in a brown jalaba, his face hidden beneath a cloth wrap. He didn't speak, only brought her a tin bowl of water and bread and left without acknowledging her pleas. Hours passed, or maybe days, time blurred. Each sound outside the door, gravel crunching, voices murmuring, keys jingling, set her nerves ablaze. She counted every second between the noises, tried to mark time by the meals, but the irregularity made it impossible to track. She wasn't just trapped physically. She was being erased. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Paris, Claire's sister Natalie noticed something was off. Claire had been meticulous in sharing her travel details, uploading photos, checking in with voice notes every morning. But suddenly everything went silent. No social media updates, no texts, no confirmation of her arrival in Merzouga. Initially, Natalie chalked it up to poor signal, but by the second day without contact, unease settled in her gut. She reached out to the Airbnb host in Marrakesh, but Salma responded with a curt message saying Claire had checked out 2 days prior for her desert tour. Natalie contacted the tour company Claire had mentioned in passing, only to be told they had no record of her. Panicked, she called the local police, but the language barrier and jurisdictional confusion made progress slow. Claire was just another tourist presumed to be off-grid. The embassy wasn't much better, polite, but unbothered. Give it a few more days, they said. But Natalie knew her sister. Claire wouldn't go dark like this. Back in the compound, Claire had begun to notice the patterns. The same guard brought food, always avoiding her eyes. A second prisoner, unseen but occasionally heard. Muffled cries, a cough, once a hoarse voice whispering something she couldn't decipher. Confirmed she wasn't alone. When the door opened one day and she was unshackled, she expected punishment or worse. Instead, she was led down a hall into a larger room where 2 women sat on a dusty mat. Both were pale, underweight, and sunburnt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. One introduced herself as Emma, from the UK, taken 3 months earlier during a volunteering opportunity in a rural village. The other, Layla, was Moroccan, born in Casablanca, and had been abducted after leaving her shift at a hotel in Ouarzazate. Their stories were different, but the endings the same. They were taken under the guise of opportunity or trust and brought here to be broken. Claire listened, horrified, as they explained how no ransom had ever been demanded, no negotiations made. This wasn't about money. It was about disappearance, control, and erasure. Emma told her about others, men and women who had come and gone. Some had been sold off, others used for labor or worse. Claire's stomach churned. This wasn't just a rogue crime, it was a system. She tried to remain calm, but fear coiled around her like a tightening noose. That night, she didn't sleep. Every breath she took was shallow, her heart racing against the silence. When she asked Emma and Layla why no one had come, Emma looked at her with deadened eyes and said, "Because they make sure no one knows where we go. The world forgets us the moment we enter that van." That line echoed in Claire's mind as she curled up in the corner of her cell again, tears streaming down her face. Her dreams no longer offered escape, only deeper fear, shadowed figures, and distorted screams. Days later, back in Europe, Natalie began tracking her sister's digital footprint with the help of a tech-savvy friend. They traced her last known GPS ping to a vague location outside Marrakesh before the signal vanished entirely. That breadcrumb was enough to reignite her determination. She created a digital missing persons campaign, reaching out to travel forums, vloggers, and even Reddit. A A few strangers offered to help. One claimed a cousin had also vanished on a desert tour 2 years prior. Another mentioned rumors of tourists disappearing in the region, never covered by mainstream press. Natalie started connecting the dots. Though police dismissed the links, she knew there was a pattern, a story no one wanted to tell. Claire, meanwhile, had stopped asking for answers. She watched, listened, waited. Her body weakened, but her mind sharpened. Every guard rotation, every strange sound, every locked door. She memorized it all. She understood now that survival required patience. There was no rescue coming, not yet. She would have to find a way to escape, but first she had to understand the enemy. When a new man appeared one morning, well-dressed, with a clipboard and fluent English, he knelt beside her and said, "We're finally going to put you to use." Something in his voice chilled her more than the shackles ever could. As he stood and turned to leave, Claire met Emma's eyes. They didn't speak, but the fear they shared was a language in itself. Claire was no longer shackled to the wall, but freedom, she quickly realized, was a lie expertly crafted to break the mind instead of the body. She and the others were allowed to roam within a defined section of the compound. A circular dirt courtyard surrounded by high, sun-bleached walls and a series of connected rooms, each housing a different captive. The guards were fewer than she expected, always armed but aloof, as if they had been doing this for so long they no longer needed to assert control through brute force. Their confidence was its own kind of prison. Meals were sparse, watery porridge, dry bread, stale dates, and rationed just enough to keep them alive but too little to sustain real strength. Every day blended into the next, dictated not by the sun or clock but by the rhythm of footfalls and locked doors. Claire observed everything. Who lingered near which door, who whispered when the guards weren't looking, and who had already given up. Some prisoners avoided eye contact, their eyes permanently glazed, while others clung to Claire's arrival like it was the first gust of fresh air they'd felt in months. Emma had stopped talking altogether, drifting through the compound like a ghost. Layla was stronger, or at least more defiant, often snapping at guards and refusing to eat when provoked. She told Claire bits and pieces. There were different wings in the compound, some worse than others. One room, known only as the cage, was used as punishment, where the floor was electrified and prisoners were thrown in for days without food. No one returned from it the same. Claire listened, trying not to betray the fear crawling up her spine. She asked questions cautiously, careful not to draw too much attention. When she inquired about what put to use meant, Layla merely glanced toward the far end of the courtyard where a rusted metal door stood shut, never opened unless a guard was dragging someone through it. No one ever came back that same day. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. Then there was Amira, a French-Moroccan woman in her 30s who had been there the longest. She was the unofficial chronicler of the place, storing every face, every escape attempt, and every death like bookmarks in her mind. Amira had once tried to break out through the ventilation ducts, only to be caught and beaten so badly she lost vision in one eye. She spoke with the detached clarity of someone who had accepted her reality but refused to let it claim her identity. She told Claire that the compound was likely one of several hidden across the desert, run by a web of traffickers, mercenaries, and corrupt officials. They didn't just traffic people, they experimented on isolation, indoctrination, even illegal labor trades. Claire's breath caught when Amira said she'd once seen trucks loaded with frightened faces being sent off into the dunes at night, only for the vehicles to return empty and silent by dawn. Rumors of buyers swirled like the desert wind, never seen but always felt. One night, Claire was summoned to the main hall. It was the first time she had been separated from the others without force. A new man was waiting there, clean-shaven, mid-40s, wearing a linen suit that looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a prison. He introduced himself as Idris and smiled like a friend. He offered her tea and asked polite questions. Where was she from? What did she do? Did she have a boyfriend? Claire didn't answer and he didn't push. Instead, he explained that she was now part of a transition program, a protocol for captives who had shown signs of adaptation. It sounded like rehabilitation, but the undertone chilled her. She would be assigned tasks, laundry, food distribution, basic cleaning. If she complied, her privileges would grow. If she resisted, the consequences would be unpleasant. Claire nodded, not in agreement, but in a quiet act of survival. From that day forward, her days were structured. She washed dishes, swept the halls, handed out meals to others who had once stared at her as the newcomer. But even in these small movements, Claire plodded. She counted doors. She noted how many steps it took to reach each section. She memorized guard shifts and routines. Occasionally, she'd find odd clues, scratches on the walls, initials etched into the underside of tables. Once even a torn photo of a little girl tucked inside a loose brick. Every sign of someone before her was a thread of humanity she clung to. During laundry duty, she discovered a door with a faulty lock that didn't click shut all the way. She began slipping scraps of information there, notes scrawled on linen using tea-stained fingers, sketches of the compound layout, guesses at guard routes. She didn't know if anyone would find them. Maybe it was foolish hope. But it gave her purpose, and that was enough to dull the edge of despair. Still, not all was strategy and control. The nights remained the worst. The sound of sobbing behind thin walls, the occasional scream that was abruptly cut off, and the silent emptiness that followed reminded Claire just how fragile their existence was. Every once in a while, someone simply disappeared. No announcement, no ceremony, just an empty mattress and silence. The remaining prisoners would avoid the topic, fearing that speaking names summoned the same fate. Claire learned to tuck her thoughts away during the dark hours, to press her ear against the cold stone floor and focus on the rhythm of distant footsteps instead of the chaos in her mind. One day, she returned from her cleaning duty to find Layla gone. No explanation. Her corner had been cleared, her blanket folded neatly as if erasing her had become routine. Claire confronted a guard, but he simply stared through her as if she didn't exist. The next day, Idris told her with unsettling calm that resistance leads to removal. No one ever used the word death, but its presence hung over every exchange like a dagger waiting to drop. Claire didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just went back to work, her movements tighter, sharper, more focused. She was done waiting for rescue. The compound had rules, dark, twisted ones, but even those rules had cracks. And she would find them, because staying passive was no longer survival, it was surrender. The first spark of real hope came not from outside, but from within. A fleeting whisper, a stolen glance, a coded message tucked into a pile of soiled laundry. Claire had grown close to a prisoner named Tomasz, a quiet Polish backpacker who had been abducted near the Algerian border. He spoke little, but his eyes burned with the kind of intensity that comes only from someone who refuses to surrender. They began trading fragments of knowledge, confirming suspicions about weak structural points in the compound, calculating guard rotations, identifying blind spots in the surveillance system. Tomasz believed that behind the eastern storage wall was an access tunnel, once used for deliveries, now partially blocked by debris and sand. The route was risky, narrow, and might lead nowhere, but it was their only shot. For weeks, they prepared in secret, gathering stolen keys, testing doors at night, marking the tunnel's loose stones with small scratches only they could decipher. Emma, once silent and broken, rejoined their circle with reluctant courage, offering insights about guard routines learned during her time on food service. Every moment outside their cells became an act of rebellion wrapped in routine. The night they chose was dry and moonless, the desert winds howling like ancient spirits just beyond the compound walls. Claire's pulse was deafening in her ears as she followed Tomasz through the courtyard under the pretense of taking kitchen waste to the disposal pit. The guards had grown lax with the trusted prisoners, never suspecting the routines they themselves had enforced could become the very tools of subversion. At the far end of the yard, a shadow shifted. The signal was clear. They moved swiftly toward the old storage shed, slid inside, and pried open the false wall they had spent weeks loosening stone by stone. The tunnel yawned before them, damp and thick with the scent of mold and decay. Tomasz went first, crawling forward on hands and knees, Claire behind him and Emma last. For a few sacred moments it felt real. They were escaping, tasting the first breath of freedom beneath the earth. But that hope shattered with the thunder of boots overhead. A floodlight pierced the tunnel entrance. Voices roared in Arabic. Gunshots rang out not to kill but to terrorize. Tomasz pushed Claire forward with all his strength just as hands seized his ankles and dragged him back into the light. Claire screamed but kept crawling, blinded by fear, until she reached a dead end. Brick and concrete, sealed long ago. It had been a trap, a relic of a past escape attempt now used to bait the desperate. Within seconds, guards swarmed the tunnel, yanked Claire and Emma out, and beat them both with batons wrapped in cloth to avoid visible bruises. Tomasz's screams echoed through the compound for what felt like hours. When silence finally came, Claire was thrown into the cage. A steel room no bigger than a closet, with a floor wired for shocks that pulsed randomly, keeping sleep and sanity just out of reach. The air was thick and hot, the walls dripping condensation from the rising desert humidity. Time unraveled in there. Minutes felt like hours, and hours collapsed into a haze of dizziness, hallucinations, and dread. When they finally pulled her out, her legs gave out. She had no idea how long she'd been inside. Emma was worse. She didn't speak anymore, just sat in a corner of her room rocking back and forth with vacant eyes. Tomasz was gone. No one said where. Some believed he was sold. Others whispered he'd been executed as an example. The rest of the prisoners withdrew further, as if Claire's failed rebellion had poisoned hope for everyone. The guards didn't need to increase the violence. They had won with silence. But what came next was worse than physical punishment. Idris returned, this time without his faux charm. He visited Claire daily, sometimes just staring, other times offering water or conversation, always with a crooked smile that hinted at something darker. "You're alone now," he said once, gently brushing hair from her bruised face. "You thought you were strong, but you're not built for this. No one is." They began testing her. Sometimes the door would be left ajar for 10 minutes, unmanned. Sometimes food was left out, unsupervised. Each time, Claire hesitated, suspecting a trap. And each time, the moment she moved toward it, a guard would appear with a smirk and shake his head. They watched her with invisible eyes, waiting for her to reach again for hope so they could punish her for it. One day she found a letter in her cot, folded into an origami flower. It was written in English, addressed to no one. The words described pain, disorientation, and finally surrender. At the bottom, in faint ink, a name was signed. Amira. Claire hadn't seen her in over a week. She hadn't even realized until that moment. That was how they broke you, by making you forget to care. As the weeks dragged on, Claire's mind frayed at the edges. She began to hear things that weren't there. Bells chiming, voices of her family calling from the courtyard, even Tomasz laughing in her ear. Her body moved on autopilot. Eat, sleep, work, repeat. She scribbled notes to herself in the dirt, then erased them before guards could see. Her old instincts for planning and observation dulled under the weight of hopelessness. Every morning she expected to wake up screaming, but the screams stayed locked in her chest. Then one night something changed. A new prisoner arrived. A girl, barely 16, dragged into the courtyard in broad daylight. She was hysterical, crying, calling out for her mother. Claire watched from behind the barred window of the kitchen, her blood boiling. That night, she sat in the dark, staring at her reflection in the metal water bowl, and made a promise. The next time a chance came, no matter how small, she would take it. Not for herself, but for the girl. Because even if she had nothing left, she could still give someone else the hope they had stolen from her. While Claire's world shrank to four walls and the rhythmic dread of survival, a fragile thread of her existence continued to flutter far beyond the compound's reach. In London, a woman named Julia Denvers, a former foreign correspondent turned freelance investigative journalist, stumbled across a post that ignited something deep inside her. It was buried in a travel forum thread titled "Tourists Missing in Morocco," and featured a collage of amateur research, blurry screenshots, and one chilling photo. Claire, smiling against the backdrop of a desert campfire, time-stamped just hours before her disappearance. The original poster was Natalie, Claire's sister, who had refused to give up even after authorities dismissed her concerns. Julia, who had spent years chasing leads in war-torn regions and exposing systemic corruption, recognized the desperation in Natalie's words, and more importantly, the silences in the official responses she had quoted. There were patterns here, echoes of something bigger. It was subtle, almost designed to go unnoticed. But Julia had seen this kind of web before. She reached out to Natalie under the guise of a fellow traveler, drawing out the details without setting off alarm bells. Once she had the full timeline, she began digging into missing persons records, combing through embassy archives, cross-referencing names that had surfaced in obscure news articles. A woman named Leah DuPont vanished in 2019 during a volunteering stint outside Erfoud. A man named Jesper Salberg, last seen boarding a private shuttle to Merzouga in 2021. An American couple who had gone off-grid in 2022, leaving behind only a confusing report of their rental car being found abandoned near the dunes. Julia reached out to their families. Some never responded. Others spoke in hushed tones, worn down by years of dead ends and false leads. But the similarities were undeniable. Solo travelers, small groups, alternative desert tours booked outside mainstream operators, all vanishing near the same geographic pocket. The Moroccan authorities insisted the desert was dangerous, accidents common, and the burden of proof lay with the missing to prove foul play. But Julia didn't buy it. With Natalie's help, she began compiling a case file. They mapped every known disappearance onto a satellite view of the region, highlighting overlap points and possible routes. Then, through a contact in the French consulate, Julia acquired information about land purchases in the remote desert. Deeds signed by shell companies, some linked to foreign investors, others to defunct charities. One parcel stood out, a sprawling section of fenced land never recorded as developed, nestled between two rocky ridges outside Tagounite. It didn't appear on tourism maps or official infrastructure plans, but Julia's contact confirmed satellite scans showed a faint rectangular outline, consistent with a compound structure. She flagged the location and cross-referenced it with old French colonial maps. That land had once been used as a supply depot during the 1930s, with underground storage tunnels still intact. It was a perfect place to hide something or someone. Simultaneously, Claire's latest captor, an older guard known only as Hassan, began to falter in his indifference. He had been in the compound longer than most, his limp and distant stare hinting at a past soaked in regret. For reasons she didn't understand, he began pausing by her cell longer than necessary, sometimes offering a second piece of bread or glancing over his shoulder, before letting her sit a few moments longer outside. Claire didn't trust him, couldn't afford to, but she didn't ignore it either. One night, as she passed him during dish duty, he slipped a torn page into her hand. It was from a discarded French newspaper, dated 2 weeks earlier. The article headline read, "British woman vanished in Morocco. Sister claims international cover-up." Beneath it was a blurry photo of her, standing outside a riad in Marrakesh. Claire froze, the image burning into her mind. The world hadn't forgotten. Someone out there was looking. That one page gave her more strength than 100 meals. The next morning, Julia uploaded a detailed blog post under the title, "The Desert Vanishes. Where are Morocco's missing travelers?" Quickly went viral. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags, comparisons to other disappearances, and outrage directed at both Moroccan tourism boards and foreign embassies. Influencers posted videos warning tourists to avoid unlicensed desert tours. Pressure mounted. Then came a breakthrough. A Moroccan guide named Karim, who had once worked near the Tagounite region, messaged Julia anonymously. He said he'd heard whispers of a place locals called La Garde, a ghost facility buried in the sand, guarded by men with radios and guns, and avoided even by smugglers. Karim wouldn't go himself, but he knew someone who might. With growing international attention, Julia coordinated with Natalie and secured an interview on a major European morning show. Natalie pleaded with calm determination, showing childhood photos of Claire, recounting her last messages, and demanding intervention. Public sentiment shifted. Petitions flooded embassies. Diplomatic pressure trickled through official channels. Back at the compound, the guards grew tense. Orders changed. Patrols became more erratic. Claire sensed something brewing. Emma, though still distant, began responding to Claire's whispers at night. The new girl, Zara, watched everything, her youthful curiosity never quite broken by the despair. Hassan stopped appearing altogether. One afternoon, while cleaning storage crates, Claire found another newspaper scrap, this time in Arabic. She couldn't read it, but she recognized her name printed in English letters. That same day, a buzzing sound, faint and distant, filled the sky above the compound. A drone. It hovered briefly, then vanished. Claire didn't speak of it, but her hands shook for hours. It was real, not a hallucination. Someone was close. Julia's final move was bold. She sent her findings to a network of freelance documentarians who had previously worked undercover in Libya and Syria. They agreed to investigate the region under the guise of ecotourists documenting Bedouin tribes. With drones, bribes, and clever disguises, they filmed the outskirts of the suspected compound and recorded strange comings and goings, military-grade trucks, armed men, and makeshift tents that never appeared on official maps. When they aired the footage alongside Julia's exposé, the reaction was immediate. International NGOs demanded transparency. The Moroccan government, now under pressure, reluctantly announced a joint task force to investigate illegal desert operations near Tagaunite. Journalists and human rights observers were dispatched. Inside the compound, guards barked new orders. Rooms were cleared, prisoners shuffled, evidence burned. Claire watched fires rise from behind locked gates, their smoke thick and foul. That night, as she lay on the cold stone, she felt something she hadn't in months. A tremor not of fear, but of momentum. The walls that had trapped her mind were beginning to crack. If a drone could find them, if a newspaper could carry her face across continents, then maybe, just maybe, the silence she had been buried in would finally be shattered. And when it broke, she would be ready. The morning began with silence so absolute it unsettled every prisoner. Usually, the compound echoed with routine. Metal doors creaking, boots dragging, shouts in Arabic, the clang of ration trays. But today, it was as if the entire facility had inhaled and held its breath. Claire felt it the moment she opened her eyes. Even the guards, when they finally appeared, moved with unnatural haste, faces grim and focused. Prisoners were herded out into the courtyard in small groups, not for work or punishment, but for head counts. Claire noticed Zara clutching her arm as they were lined up, her lips trembling with questions she dared not ask aloud. The compound had never felt orderly, but this morning it was different, strategic, defensive, like something was coming. Claire exchanged a look with Emma, who hadn't spoken since the failed escape, but her eyes flicked toward the desert horizon just once, as if she too had sensed the shift. Within an hour, half of the storage room was cleared, files burned in steel barrels, crates moved into transport trucks. A convoy had arrived in the night. She counted 6 vehicles, 3 large, 2 armed, and 1 completely blacked out. The kind of vehicle that belonged to people who answered to no one. Idris reappeared, barking orders, no longer hiding behind charm or performance. His mask had slipped. Claire watched him slap a guard across the face for moving too slowly. He carried a radio now, which never left his side, and kept glancing up at the sky. Then, at precisely noon, everything erupted. The sound of an approaching chopper shattered the desert stillness like a scream. Dust surged into the compound, people scattered, and gunfire rang out from somewhere near the north wall. Claire dropped to the ground, dragging Zara with her. Panic swallowed the courtyard. Guards shouting into radios, prisoners scrambling for cover, doors slamming shut. From her position near the well, Claire glimpsed a flash of movement beyond the outer gates. Figures dressed in black tactical gear scaling the perimeter wall with practiced precision. Explosions thundered near the eastern shed, flames leaping as smoke curled into the blue sky. She couldn't process what she was seeing. After months of hopelessness, the outside world had returned in the form of chaos and fire. One of the guards grabbed Zara by the arm and tried to drag her inside. Claire lunged without thinking, throwing herself onto his back. They toppled, and she screamed at Zara to run. A boot connected with her ribs, knocking the wind from her, but another prisoner, an older man Claire had never even spoken to, rushed in and hit the guard with a brick. There were no more sides, no more rules. Survival was the only allegiance. Claire stumbled to her feet, blood in her mouth, and bolted after Zara, who had disappeared behind the central hall. Gunfire crackled again, closer this time. From a shattered window, Claire saw the compound's front gate blown open, smoke pouring through. The tactical team moved like ghosts, silent, swift, focused. One of them made eye contact with her and gestured for her to get down. A second later, a round of bullets tore through the wall behind her. Claire ducked, her heart racing faster than it ever had. Every sound, every shadow felt electric, charged with possibility and death in equal measure. She found Emma huddled in the corner of their old cell, unresponsive. Claire tried to shake her awake, but Emma was lost, eyes darting without focus, lips trembling silently. Claire had to make a choice: stay and die with her, or leave and fight for a future she wasn't even sure existed anymore. With tears streaking her dirt-caked face, she kissed Emma's forehead, whispered, "I'll come back," and ran. The hallways were now battle zones, flickering with muzzle flashes and shouted commands. A guard emerged at the end of the corridor, rifle raised, but before he could fire, he was taken down by one of the rescuers. The soldier moved toward her, checked her wrists, and handed her a radio. "British?" he asked. She nodded. "You're Claire. We've been looking for you." His words barely registered. She collapsed into him, overwhelmed. "We're not done yet," he added, scanning the room. "There's still others." Outside, the compound was unrecognizable. Doors blown open, fires raging, prisoners being loaded onto armored vehicles. Claire saw Tomash alive barely, being helped onto a stretcher. She wept when she saw him move. She counted at least 20 others, dazed but free, some limping, some carried, all blinking into the sun as if it were the first time they'd seen it in years. Claire refused to leave without Zara. She screamed her name into the smoke, tearing through the wreckage until a soldier grabbed her and pointed. Zara stood near the wall, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her face pale but safe. They ran to each other and embraced like family. But not everyone made it out. Amira's name was never called. Emma remained lost inside, beyond reach. Claire looked back as the chopper blade spun overhead, watching the compound shrink beneath them. From above, it looked almost small, insignificant, a beige scar on the earth. But she knew the weight it carried. In the days that followed, international news exploded. The footage aired by the freelance documentarians had sparked outrage, and the operation had been sanctioned at the highest level under quiet pressure from European governments. Moroccan authorities denied prior knowledge, claimed rogue elements were responsible. Investigations launched. Arrests were made. But many key players, including Idris, had vanished before the raid. It was a partial victory. Lives saved, but truth buried beneath diplomatic red tape and denials. Claire was flown to a recovery center in Spain, where she was debriefed, medically treated, and reunited with Natalie, whose embrace brought a flood of tears that couldn't be held back any longer. The days blurred after that. Therapy sessions, media interviews, restless nights haunted by memories she couldn't silence. But she refused to let the silence win again. She told her story, not just for herself but for the ones still missing, for Emma, for Amira, for the nameless prisoners whose faces she could still see every time she closed her eyes. Claire became more than a survivor, she became a voice. And though the scars would never fully fade, neither would her fire. Because in the face of ruin, she had chosen to fight. And in the end, that had made all the difference.